Maya Cole walked down the quiet sidewalk, her hands tucked into the pockets of her hoodie. The evening air was cool, and the soft glow of the streetlights flickered as she made her way home after a long and exhausting day. She had spent hours in meetings, working behind the scenes on something most people would never even know about. But tonight, she looked like any other young woman on her way home. Nothing about her appearance hinted at the truth of who she really was. As she passed a small convenience store, she noticed a group of teenagers laughing near the entrance. A man in a dark coat was buying coffee inside. Everything seemed normal. She paid no attention and kept walking. Then, just as she reached the next block, she heard the sound of a police siren behind her. She turned her head slightly, expecting to see the car speed past, but instead, the vehicle slowed down. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the nearby buildings. Her heart didn't race. She had been trained to remain calm in every situation, no matter how unexpected. But what happened next caught her off guard. The police car pulled up beside her, and two officers stepped out. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, placed his hand on his belt as he approached. The other officer, a younger man, looked tense. "You, stop right there," the older officer ordered. Maya stopped, her face neutral. She wasn't sure why they had stopped her, but she knew better than to make any sudden moves. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The older officer glanced at his partner before speaking. "We got a report about a robbery nearby. The suspect matches your description." Maya frowned slightly. "I think there's a mistake. I just got off work and—" The younger officer interrupted. "Where were you 30 minutes ago?" She exhaled quietly. "In an office. Working. Like I do every day." The older officer studied her carefully. "Do you have ID?" Maya reached into her pocket slowly. She had her wallet, but something told her showing it wouldn't change anything. Still, she handed it over. The officer flipped it open, looked at her driver's license, then back at her. "This says you live 10 blocks from here. What are you doing in this area?" Maya resisted the urge to sigh. "Walking home." The younger officer glanced at the older one. "She's acting too calm," he muttered under his breath, but Maya heard him. The older officer seemed to make up his mind. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Maya blinked. "Excuse me? You fit the description of the suspect. We need to take you in for questioning." Now, her pulse picked up slightly. This wasn't right. She knew how these situations played out, and she also knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She could have ended this right here, could have said one sentence that would make them step back. But that wasn't how her job worked. She had spent years operating in the shadows, staying unnoticed. If she revealed herself now, it could compromise everything. So she did what she had been trained to do. She remained calm. "Officer, I think there's a misunderstanding," she said evenly. The older cop shook his head. "We can talk about it at the station." Before she could say anything else, the younger officer moved in, gripping her wrist as he reached for his handcuffs. Maya tensed for a brief second. Every instinct in her body told her she could disarm them in seconds, turn this situation around, and walk away. But she didn't. Instead, she let them cuff her hands behind her back, feeling the cold metal press against her skin. She saw people passing by, some glancing at the scene before quickly looking away. No one wanted to get involved. No one ever did. The older officer radioed in. "We've got a suspect in custody. Bringing her in now." Maya kept her expression blank as they led her toward the police car. She could have spoken up, demanded a supervisor, or called someone who could clear this up immediately. But she didn't. Because Maya Cole had learned something important in her line of work. Sometimes, it was better to let people think they had won. At least for now. She stepped into the back of the police car, her mind already working 3 steps ahead. The ride to the police station was quiet. The only sounds came from the occasional crackle of the police radio and the hum of traffic outside. Maya sat in the back seat, her hands still cuffed, her mind calm but alert. She had spent years in situations far more dangerous than this, but there was something frustrating about being treated like a suspect when she had done nothing wrong. She glanced at the two officers in the front seat. The older one, the driver, kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable. The younger officer, sitting in the passenger seat, occasionally glanced back at her through the rearview mirror, as if expecting her to suddenly confess to something. Maya didn't say a word. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than speaking. When they reached the station, the officers led her inside, past a few other officers who barely gave her a second glance. This was routine for them, just another suspect brought in for questioning. No one bothered to ask if they had the right person. They took her to a small room with a metal table and a single chair. The walls were plain, the air slightly stale. A camera in the corner blinked with a small red light, recording everything. "Sit," the older officer said, gesturing to the chair. Maya sat down, her posture relaxed but composed. The officer removed the cuffs from her wrists, but the tension in the room remained. "We're going to ask you some questions," the younger officer said, pulling out a notepad. "If you cooperate, this will be easier for everyone." Maya rested her hands on the table. "I told you, I haven't done anything wrong." The older officer leaned forward slightly. "Then this shouldn't take long." For the next 20 minutes, they fired questions at her. Where had she been earlier that night? Had she seen anything suspicious? Did she know anything about the robbery? No matter how many times she gave them the same answers, they kept pressing. It was clear they had already decided she was guilty, and now they were just looking for a reason to prove it. Maya remained calm. She knew their tactics. She had been trained to resist interrogation, though she never expected to use those skills in a situation like this. She could tell they were waiting for her to slip up, to say something inconsistent, but she didn't. Eventually, the younger officer sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You're not giving us much to work with." "That's because I didn't do anything," Maya said evenly. The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner before standing up. "Stay here," he ordered before walking out of the room. The younger officer followed, leaving Maya alone. She exhaled softly and glanced at the camera. She had no doubt that someone was watching. She knew they'd check her ID, run her name through their system. They wouldn't find anything unusual. That was the way it had been set up. Her official records were clean. Just a normal woman living a normal life. Nothing in their database would tell them who she really was. Minutes passed, then more. Maya sat still, waiting. Finally, the door opened again. This time, a man in a suit walked in. He looked older, maybe in his late 50s, with sharp eyes that took in everything at once. His presence was different from the officers before him. He wasn't just another detective. He was someone higher up. He took a seat across from her and folded his hands on the table. "Miss Cole," he said in a measured voice, "my name is Lieutenant Harris. I'm overseeing this case." Maya met his gaze. "Then maybe you can finally explain why I'm here." Harris studied her for a moment. "We had a witness place you near the scene of a crime earlier tonight. That witness is wrong," she replied. "We'll determine that," he said smoothly. "But I find it interesting that you're not more concerned about the situation you're in." Maya tilted her head slightly. "Would you believe me if I said I've been through worse?" Harris smirked faintly. "That's an unusual response." She didn't answer. He leaned back in his chair. "We've checked your ID. You don't have a criminal record. No history of trouble. You have a steady job. Yet, something about you doesn't add up." Maya remained silent. Harris continued, "If you're innocent, then you have nothing to worry about. But if there's something you're not telling us, now would be the time to speak up." Maya held his gaze. "I told you everything I know." Harris sighed. "All right. You'll be kept here for a while longer while we go over some things." He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out, leaving her alone once again. Maya knew what was happening. They wanted to see if she would crack under pressure, if she would change her story. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. As she leaned back in her chair, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. They thought they were in control of this situation. Maya sat alone in the interrogation room, the ticking of the wall clock the only sound filling the silence. The walls felt closer than before, the air colder. But she wasn't afraid. She had been trained to handle pressure far beyond this, and compared to the things she had faced in the past, this was almost routine. Still, she knew she couldn't sit here forever. She glanced at the camera in the corner, knowing someone was watching. They were waiting for her to break, to panic, to start saying things out of desperation. But she wasn't like the others who had been in this chair before. She was patient. She was trained. She was ready. The door finally opened, and the younger officer walked in. His face looked tired, but his eyes carried a stubbornness that told her he wasn't giving up yet. He placed a file on the table, flipping it open as he sat across from her. "We've been digging into your story," he said, tapping his fingers against the folder. "You say you were at work, but we haven't been able to confirm that yet." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Then you didn't look hard enough." The officer exhaled through his nose, clearly annoyed. "We checked security cameras near the crime scene. You were in the area. So were 100 other people," she said calmly. "But a witness specifically identified you," he pushed. Maya leaned forward slightly. "A witness, or someone who just thought I looked like the suspect?" The officer clenched his jaw. He didn't have a real answer to that. She continued, "Let me guess. This so-called witness didn't actually see the crime happen. They just saw someone running away. And now you're trying to make that person me." The officer didn't reply right away. Instead, he turned a page in the file, pretending to review something important. Maya sat back in her chair. "You don't have anything solid, do you?" The officer frowned. "We're just doing our job." "No," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Your job is to find the truth. But instead, you've already decided I'm guilty, and now you're trying to fit the evidence around that decision." The officer's grip on the file tightened. He was frustrated. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way he shifted in his seat. He wanted her to slip up, to say something that would justify holding her here longer. But she wouldn't give him that. Before he could say anything else, the door opened again, and Lieutenant Harris walked in. Unlike the younger officer, Harris' expression was unreadable. He sat down across from Maya, adjusting his watch as if he had all the time in the world. "I've been thinking," Harris said, his voice calm. "There's something different about you." Maya didn't respond. She simply waited. "You don't ask for a lawyer," he continued. "You don't yell or demand to be let go. Most people in your position would be panicking right now." Maya shrugged. "Maybe I just know my rights." Harris smirked slightly. "Maybe. Or maybe there's something you're not telling us." Maya met his gaze. "If you had real evidence against me, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. You'd already be processing me." Harris tapped his fingers on the table. "That's true." He nodded slowly. "But you see, this isn't just about the robbery anymore. It's about why you're so calm. People who are innocent usually panic because they know they're being treated unfairly. But you're too comfortable, and that makes me curious." Maya kept her expression neutral. She knew he was testing her, trying to get inside her head. But he wasn't the first person to try, and he wouldn't be the last. She simply smiled. "Maybe I just trust the system to do its job." Harris chuckled. "That's funny, because I don't." Silence settled in the room. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where this conversation was going. Harris studied her for a long moment. Then he stood up. "We're going to keep looking into you," he said, "and when we find something, we'll talk again." Maya watched as he left the room, the younger officer following close behind. As the door clicked shut, she let out a quiet breath. They were suspicious, but they still didn't know who she really was. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Maya sat alone in the interrogation room once again. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passing minutes. She had been here for hours now, but she remained patient. She had been in far worse situations, under much greater pressure. If they thought she would break just because they left her sitting here, they were mistaken. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms as she stared at the blank wall ahead. She knew how these things worked. They were hoping she would get nervous, that she would start second-guessing herself. They wanted her to become desperate so that she would say something, anything, that could justify keeping her here longer. But she wasn't going to give them what they wanted. The door finally opened, and Lieutenant Harris walked in again. He had a file in his hands, the same one he had brought in earlier. This time, his expression was different. He wasn't just curious anymore. He was suspicious. He sat down across from her and placed the file on the table. "We ran a background check on you," he said slowly. "You have no criminal record, no history of trouble. You work an office job. You pay your bills on time. Everything about you is perfect." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Is that a problem?" Harris tilted his head slightly. "Actually, yes, because perfect people don't exist." Maya said nothing. She simply watched him, waiting for his next move. He leaned forward. "You were near the crime scene. We can't ignore that." "I was walking home," she said calmly. "That's not a crime." He smirked slightly. "No, it's not. But here's what I find interesting." He tapped the file with his fingers. "We called your workplace to verify your alibi. The person we spoke to confirmed that you worked there, but when we asked for security footage, there was an issue. The cameras weren't recording properly tonight." Maya remained still. She already knew why that had happened. It wasn't a coincidence. Harris studied her reaction carefully. "That's strange, isn't it?" She met his gaze. "Sounds like bad luck." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe. Or maybe someone doesn't want us to know exactly where you were tonight." Maya knew she had to tread carefully. Harris was sharp. He was asking the right questions, but no matter how close he got, he wasn't going to find what he was looking for. The lieutenant leaned back in his chair. "Here's my problem, Maya. You don't fit the profile of a criminal, but you also don't fit the profile of an ordinary citizen. There's something about you that's off." Maya tilted her head slightly. "Maybe you're just overthinking things." Harris smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Or maybe I'm finally starting to understand what's going on here." The younger officer from earlier walked in, handing Harris a sheet of paper. Harris glanced at it, then looked back at Maya. "Your ID checks out. Your fingerprints match, but something still isn't adding up." Maya remained silent. Harris sighed. "All right, you're free to go." Maya raised an eyebrow. She hadn't expected them to let her go so soon, but she also knew it wasn't over. Harris wasn't the type to give up easily. As the younger officer unlocked the door, Harris spoke again. "But don't go too far. I have a feeling we'll be seeing each other again." Maya stood up, straightened her jacket, and gave him a small smile. "I'll be around." With that, she walked out of the room. But as she left the police station, she could still feel Harris's eyes on her back. She knew this wasn't the end. Maya stepped out of the police station, breathing in the cool night air. The city lights flickered around her, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. She adjusted her coat and started walking, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She knew they were still watching her. The feeling of eyes on her back was unmistakable. Harris wasn't convinced of her innocence, and she had no doubt he would keep digging. But it didn't matter. He could search all he wanted. He wouldn't find anything. Because Maya Cole, as far as the world knew, was just an ordinary woman. She turned a corner, slipping into a less crowded street. Her posture remained relaxed, but her mind was sharp, calculating. Every movement, every decision she made had to be precise. She had been trained for situations like this, to stay ahead, to never leave loose ends. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number from memory. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Everything all right?" "Almost," Maya said. "I had a little delay." The voice on the other end paused. "Police." Maya exhaled. "Yeah, someone placed me near the crime scene." "Did they make the connection?" "Not yet." She glanced over her shoulder, spotting a black sedan parked near the police station. The headlights were off, but she knew someone was inside, watching. Harris wasn't done with her. "Lay low," the voice said. "We'll handle the rest." Maya nodded. "I know what to do." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She needed to move carefully now. Even though they had let her go, she knew Harris would be looking for any excuse to pull her back in. He was the kind of detective who followed his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him that Maya was hiding something, and he wasn't wrong. She took a deep breath and kept walking, disappearing into the city's winding streets. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Harris sat at his desk, staring at the file in front of him. The younger officer, Daniels, sat across from him, arms crossed. "She's lying," Daniels said. "I know it." Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he flipped through the pages, studying Maya's records again. Everything about her seemed normal, too normal. No criminal history, no past incidents, nothing out of place. And that was the problem. "She's not just lying," Harris finally said. "She's trained." Daniels frowned. "Trained?" Harris leaned back in his chair. "People who are innocent act a certain way when they're accused of a crime. They get angry. They panic. They demand answers. But Maya, she was calm. Too calm." Daniels hesitated. "You think she's what? A professional?" Harris exhaled slowly. "I think she's something we don't understand yet." Daniels looked unsure, but Harris knew what he had seen. He had interrogated hundreds of suspects in his career, and Maya wasn't like any of them. She wasn't scared. She wasn't confused. She was in control. And that meant she was dangerous. Harris reached for his phone and made a call. "Get me everything you can on Maya Cole," he said. "I don't care how deep you have to dig. I want to know who she really is." As he hung up, he glanced at the security camera footage from earlier. Maya's last words echoed in his mind. "I'll be around." Maya walked through the quiet streets, blending into the night. She kept her steps even, her breathing steady, as she moved further away from the police station. The black sedan she had spotted earlier was still there, parked a short distance away. She knew someone was inside, watching her. Harris wasn't done with her. She reached an alleyway and casually turned into it, quickening her pace slightly. Then, without warning, she pressed herself against the wall and waited. A few seconds later, the soft hum of an engine reached her ears. The sedan had followed. She smirked. They were predictable. Maya pulled out her phone and sent a single message, "Still being followed. Need an exit." Within moments, her phone vibrated with a reply, "Take the next right. Side door open." She slipped through the alley, taking a sharp right as instructed. Ahead of her was a small, nondescript building with a single metal door slightly ajar. Without hesitation, she slipped inside and closed it behind her. The moment she stepped in, she was met with the familiar face of an older man with sharp eyes and a calm expression. "Cutting it close, aren't you?" he said. Maya smiled. "Wouldn't be fun otherwise." The man shook his head and gestured for her to follow. They walked through a narrow hallway until they reached a dimly lit room filled with computer monitors and files. A woman sat at the desk, typing rapidly on a keyboard. "You got their attention," she said without looking up. "Harris is digging." Maya sighed. "I figured." The woman turned the screen toward her. "He's running deeper background checks, trying to find something that doesn't add up." Maya studied the screen. Harris was persistent, but he wouldn't find what he was looking for. Her records had been carefully built. There was no past to trace, no real history to uncover. Still, she couldn't afford to be careless. How long until they figure out the security footage was tampered with? She asked. The woman smirked. They won't. It was done clean. To them, the cameras just malfunctioned. Maya nodded. That was one less problem to worry about. But Harris himself was still an issue. He won't let this go, she said. The older man leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He's smart. He knows there's something off about you. Maya sighed. Then I need to give him a reason to move on. The woman raised an eyebrow. How? Maya smirked. By giving him something else to focus on. Back at the police station, Harris sat at his desk, staring at his screen. His gut told him there was more to Maya Cole than she let on, but no matter how much he searched, he kept hitting dead ends. It didn't make sense. People always left traces, old records, school files, medical reports. But Maya's life seemed too perfect, too carefully placed, like someone had designed it that way. Then, just as he was about to dig deeper, his phone buzzed. A robbery. An urgent case. Harris hesitated for only a second before grabbing his coat. Maya wasn't going anywhere, and he wasn't giving up on her just yet. But for now, there were other things demanding his attention. And that was exactly what Maya had planned. Maya sat in a small cafe, stirring a cup of tea as she watched the world move outside the window. The streets were busy, filled with people rushing to their destinations, unaware of the silent battle happening behind the scenes. She had done her part. The staged robbery had pulled Harris away just as expected. It wasn't a real crime, just enough of a disturbance to demand his full attention. Now he was chasing a case that would lead him nowhere, buying Maya the time she needed to cover her tracks. But she knew this wasn't over. Harris was persistent. He had the instincts of someone who didn't just follow evidence. He followed his gut, and his gut told him that Maya wasn't who she appeared to be. She took a slow sip of her tea, her mind working through the possibilities. She could disappear completely, vanish before he had the chance to find anything. But that would only confirm his suspicions. No, she needed a different plan. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the message. Your cover is still intact. But Harris isn't stopping. She sighed. Of course he wasn't. She typed a quick response. Then I'll make him stop. Sliding her phone into her pocket, she stood up and left the cafe. It was time to confront the problem head-on. Harris sat at his desk, exhausted but focused. The robbery case had turned into a dead end, just like he had expected. Something about it felt off, like it had been set up to waste his time. And that meant only one thing. Maya was buying time. He leaned back in his chair, staring at her file once more. He had been chasing criminals for years, but Maya was different. She wasn't someone who had simply made a mistake. She was careful, trained. But trained for what? As he thought, the door to his office opened. He looked up, surprised to see Maya standing there, completely calm. Detective, she said smoothly. I thought we should talk. Harris sat up, watching her closely. She wasn't nervous. If anything, she looked amused. You walk into a police station willingly? He asked, crossing his arms. That's bold. Maya smiled slightly. I figured it was time we cleared a few things up. Harris gestured to the chair across from him. All right, let's talk. She sat down, folding her hands on the desk. You think I'm hiding something? I know you are, he corrected. She tilted her head. And yet, you have no proof. Harris smirked. Not yet. Maya exhaled. Look, I get it. You're good at your job. You see patterns others don't. But you're wasting your time on me. Harris studied her. Am I? She leaned in slightly. If I were really involved in something illegal, do you think I'd be sitting here, talking to you? Harris didn't respond. He knew what she was doing, turning the conversation back on him, making him question himself. But he wasn't that easy to shake. You're careful, he admitted. I'll give you that. But I don't believe in coincidences. And you being at that crime scene, that wasn't an accident. Maya leaned back, smiling. Then prove it. Harris narrowed his eyes. Maya stood up. I think we're done here. She turned to leave, but before she walked out, she glanced over her shoulder. You should be careful, detective. Sometimes, when you dig too deep, you don't like what you find. Then she was gone. Harris exhaled, rubbing his temple. Something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. Harris sat at his desk long after Maya left, staring at the empty chair she had occupied just moments ago. His gut told him something was off, but he had no proof. Nothing that could hold up in court. Still, he wasn't ready to let this go. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. A few seconds later, Daniels picked up. Lieutenant. Daniels sounded confused. I thought you left for the night. I need you to check something for me, Harris said, his voice firm. Pull every security camera near the police station. I want to know where Maya Cole went after she walked out of here. Daniels hesitated. Sir, I thought we were dropping this case. Harris clenched his jaw. Just do it. After ending the call, he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Maya was playing a game, but he wasn't sure what the rules were yet. And that bothered him. Meanwhile, Maya walked through the city with steady steps, her mind calm. She had expected Harris to push harder, to keep digging. But now, after their conversation, she knew he was at a crossroads. He had nothing to hold her on, no evidence to move forward. That meant she had won. For now. She turned a corner and entered a quiet building, heading toward the back where a door waited for her. A fingerprint scanner blinked red until she placed her thumb against it. A second later, the door clicked open. Inside, the room was dark except for the glow of several computer screens. The woman from before, her tech contact, was waiting. He's still watching you, the woman said without looking away from her screen. He just pulled up surveillance footage. Maya smirked. Let him look. He won't find anything. The woman shook her head. You really enjoy this, don't you? Maya chuckled. It keeps things interesting. She sat down, watching as the woman typed rapidly on the keyboard. We'll clean up any loose ends, the woman said. By morning, Harris won't have a single lead left. Maya nodded. Good. But as she said it, a small part of her hesitated. Harris wasn't like the others. He was sharp, determined. And for the first time in a long time, someone had come close, to uncovering the truth about her. She didn't know whether to feel relief or something else. Shaking off the thought, she stood up. Make sure it's done right. The woman gave a slight nod. Always. Maya turned to leave, but before stepping out, she took one last glance at the screens. Harris's face was still there, his eyes focused, determined. She smirked to herself. This was over. At least for now. Back at the police station, Harris sighed as he stared at the blank security footage. Maya Cole had vanished. No trail, no trace, nothing. It was as if she had never been there at all. He exhaled and leaned back in his chair. Something told him this wasn't the last time he would see her, and next time, he would be ready.